So, Alex, welcome to our conversation. We're so
Thank
excited.
you.
Yeah, we're so excited to be talking about what does it mean to be radically human. And this was a question first posed by JLo in a conversation some months ago, and we just decided to run with it because we feel like, well, the atmosphere is endangered, the biosphere is endangered, and even our humanity looks to be in danger. So that makes for a good starting point, I think, for a conversation. And maybe you'd like to just jump in on any of those themes.
Wow. So first of all, it's so nice to be back. So nice to see you all guys. I really, really love our conversations. I left last time the conversation with this sort of excitement about the ideas that we shared, and it happens every time. And I think actually what you are doing is the radical the attempt to re-engender radical humanity. But I suppose actually the question is, what does it mean to be radically human? And I think probably because when you actually posed the question, I started thinking about how would I respond to that? How do we define humanity? Can we define humanity without everything that makes humans humans? And if we do, then the next step is, well, what are the boundaries of what makes humans human? Well, it's our relationships, I think. And so, but our relationships, not just with each other, but with everything. And so lately, I've been thinking and discussing quite at length with a dear friend of mine who is a Cherokee political philosopher about the nature, the fundamental principles that or pillars that underpin, in his view, Cherokee political and social philosophy. And there are three pillars that are quite universally understood and accepted among indigenous scholars, leaders, and communities. And they are relationality, responsibility, and reciprocity. The idea that we are constantly in relation. We are in relation with each other. We are in relation with everything that is around us. We are even in relation with ideas and principles. It's what Plato called the world of ideas, right? The noumena, if you want to. And so we are constantly in relation with anger. We're constantly in relation with pain. We're constantly in relation with memory. So if we see the world as a web of relations, then it follows that those relations make us who we are, both by subtraction and by addiction. So it adds to who we are. It defines. So all these relations define who we are. And I think that's the first point. I'll get to the other two in a second. But one more thing that I want to say about relationality is that I was hearing the other day an interview by Elon Musk, who said that he has this expansionist mindset against people who have an extinctionist mindset. I think he's right in pointing out that there are two particular worldviews that are in clashing at the moment. And he's right to say that one thinks that growth can be infinite, either because you have infinite resources or because you have infinite technological capacity to exploit ever new resources. But history doesn't really prove that to be the case. And the Jason paradox says that effectively that's not the case with technology. The other mindset is often presented as a mindset of limits. We exist within a limited world. We exist within boundaries that are shaped by the world. But I think that's an incorrect and somewhat dreary way of describing it. So the other mindset to me is not a mindset of limits. It's a mindset of relations. If I think that I'm constantly in relations to everything, I don't have limits. I have relations, and the relations define who I am. And therefore, it follows that the other two pillars are important, and that's responsibilities and reciprocity. And responsibility means that if I am in a relation, I have a responsibility toward all the relations that I engage with. And I have to be aware of that constantly. And reciprocity means that I don't expect things. Instead, I expect to give back for everything that I receive from my relations. That way of seeing the world, to me, is probably the most ancient and the most radical way of rethinking how, in an ancient way, how we are. It's a way of remembering the future, so to speak.
Oh, nice.
Alex, tell us a little bit about your new book. Yeah.
Yes.
Very
So,
impressive.
well, thank you, thank you. So that's the culmination. I think when we were discussing last time, I was approaching the end of editing the book, and the book is the culmination of the 15 years of work that I did in the wild law, rights of nature, ecocide, what I call ecological jurisprudence movement. I put together all the conversations that I had with people, all my thinking that I had, and I wanted to map, first of all, the worldview within which Western legal systems see environmental damage as either invisible or irrelevant, legally speaking. And so the idea that, we can destroy a forest, but if it is lawful to do so, legally, that destruction is either invisible or irrelevant. And so I wanted to ask the question of why is it so? What is it that makes that forest possible to be seen or not to be seen at law? And so I spent a few chapters really going in depth into the history of Western philosophy. And I purposely chose to start with Western philosophy because it is within Western legal theory that worldview is located. So I wanted to cast it against the philosophical milestones from which it emerged. And so I went back to Anaximenes and Odo of Tournai throughout the history of the Western philosophical documents that we possess. And then I tried to expand that to the other worldviews that have, the other perspectives that have been located in Western philosophy, and then the other worldviews that actually have challenged those particular dominant tendencies. And so, the father of philosophy said that all things are full of gods. There's a little fragment actually that says all things are full of gods. That's the beginning, one of the first fragments that we have in Western philosophy. The idea that animism is the fundamental principle at the birth of recorded philosophy or documentary philosophy. So I tried to map that. And then from that, I actually tried to map the emergence of this tendency toward what I call an ecological jurisprudence. So a theory and practice of law that is informed by an ecological awareness. Like fully aware that the term ecology was introduced 100 or so years ago. And so it's a relatively novel term, but we can call it a relational jurisprudence if we want to. But given that we are inscribed in a particular worldview, I called it ecological jurisprudence. And so the book maps the philosophical foundations, the emergence of an ecological jurisprudence, the various aspects that it took, the various reflections that have occurred in the various strands, be it ecocide, be it rights of nature, and so on, and what they mean. Like, what does it mean to speak of an ecological jurisprudence? So that's in a nutshell, the summary of the book.
Wow. You had a statement early in the one of the first chapters, and I thought it was a really relevant question for what we're talking about today. What is it about our modern consciousness that enables us to avoid seeing the disastrous results of our way of life? And to some extent, that's what we're looking to do here with this radically human movement. We're trying to provide sight to the blind, so to speak. And how do you think? What type of methods or what type of approaches could be taken to change people's blindness concerning the consequences of the modern way of life? A very
I've been,
question.
I've been thinking about that for the last few days, and Frank, this, like your writing has been inspiring me in thinking along those lines. So when you say like changing yourself is changing the planet, rethinking who you are is rethinking what the planet is. So I think that's the first thing, is re-embracing our being as beings through movement, through food, through sleep, through the very basic primal needs and functions that we have. So I think actually the first thing is actually reverting back to the primal functions of being. How do we engage with the air we breathe? How fast or slow or deep do we breathe? So it's not enough to have air. How do we, it's the yogi principle, but doesn't have to be yogi, right? So it's, do we deep breathe? Do we breathe deeply in the chest, so in the belly, or do we breathe shallowly in the chest? What does that do for our thinking? So air, first of all. What do we drink? Do we prioritize water when we are thirsty, or do we drink something else? Do we add things to what is the primary need? And how sweeter does water taste when one is thirsty and only has either cold or lukewarm water, depending on what one likes? What about food? What about the primal food? Like, often we get overwhelmed, we get sensory overwhelmed by getting all this very tasty food, but too tasty sometimes, right? The Spartans had this, the Spartoi, I should say, not the Spartans. The Spartoi actually trained from the age of 7 in the Agoge to eat the most basic and bland food. Not because they were self-flagellating, but because they knew that by doing that from the age of 7, by the time they reached the age of 30, they couldn't stomach heavy foods. So they would have always had like an appreciation for the basic foods. Clearly not a potato, because they didn't have potatoes, but if they had a potato would be the equivalent. And I think so. Food is the third level. What about sleep? Do we sleep deeply? How do we fall asleep? Do we fall asleep with the electric lights that really change everything? Or do we actually spend maybe half an hour with a candle before falling asleep? Something as simple as that. And I was talking to my friend here and saying how important it is, I think, just before falling asleep, of shutting down all the lights, putting away the phone, the computer, and everything, and just spend half an hour, 45 minutes, just with a candle or a few candles around. That light already changes the way in which we interact with ourselves. I don't know whether there are frequencies, vibration, I have no idea, but it does change something at the very, very core of what you feel actually on that night.
Yes.
Do we sleep with the sun cycle? Like again, that depends on where one is located. Easy for me to do in Australia. I have no curtains. I sleep when the sun comes up, and I go to bed when the sun goes, a little bit after the sun goes down. So I actually sleep in normal cycle. My circadian cycle is connected to the sun. I went to Norway for my birthday around New Year's Eve. Harder to do that when you actually have 4 hours of light.
Right.
So of course, like, latitude makes a difference here, of course. But still, like, there's a saying, the Lakota used to say that, or still say, that the circadian rhythms determine our personality. If you're born in a time when you have a lot of light, you take life more easily because you know that light will come. If you're born in the heart of winter where you've got 4 hours, you want to do things done as soon as possible and as soon as you can. So, and then in addition to that, how do we deal with our health? Do we see our health as a collective thing, and do we push through, or do we immediately go back to a medicine, so a pharmaceutical response if we actually have a tiny cut or something? Or like, I'm looking at my mom the other day. She goes to swim in a rock pool in Sydney, and 2 waves came unexpectedly. The first one she managed to withstand, but the second one smashed her against the rocks, and her leg, the front of her shin, was completely mangled by the rocks. And it was literally, it was quite extensive as an injury. She refused to take antibiotics, saying, "I only take it if I really have to and if it swells." And it didn't. So she withstood the pain and she went dancing the day after and swimming 2 days after. And I think that kind of stoic attitude means that health is seen more holistically. It's not something that we have to fix. It's something that we have to learn from.
Right.
And then we can go and we can add the layers, right? So if you're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, then we go up. What about our learning? What about engagement with things? Do we have this fear of missing out, and we fall for the propaganda that says that we have to read every book and watch every movie and play every game and listen to every song? Or are we just happy to see what the universe gives us and be content with whatever books we can read and are interested in reading, whatever movies we want to watch, and so on and so forth? So I don't know. I think I went in a little bit in a long-winded answer, but to me, it's actually going back to the primary needs and really engaging with those primary needs to define who we are.
Very nice.
Well, one of my favorite subjects in all of this is stress. And I'm really curious about what stress does to us as human beings and whether it has a dehumanizing effect. As I look in the world, especially the world of politics, I see a lot of bad behavior. And I'm starting to think that a lot of our bad behavior, our unhuman behavior, is a stress response. And what do you think about that? I mean, is stress really taking away our humanity?
Mm-hmm.
It's a really interesting point because I don't think you made it as explicitly when you were writing the way the false tigers, but it was there, right? So the idea that we are in an evolutionary mismatch where chronic stress is affecting us far more than it would in another setting, and but this idea of does that make us less human or different humans rather than less humans,
Right.
less human? And it's a really interesting question because maybe it doesn't change our humanity. Maybe it emphasizes one or a few of our relations. So if we are defined by our relations, what stress as a signal does is that it emphasizes our relation with fear, our relation with sloth, maybe, relation with inaction. And we can see it, like, the political, as you were saying, the political rhetoric, not worldwide, but certainly in certain authoritarian states like Russia, the US, and all the various authoritarian regimes actually that exist in the world. And I did that on purpose of paralleling the two. And I feel for the vast majority of those who are not in relationship with fear. I really feel for all of you who are not in relationship with fear and are dealing with the effect of those who have been in relationship with fear are causing on the rest of the nation and on the rest of the world. But I think actually if we are in relationship with those elements, of course this authoritarian regime will emphasize the fear of the stranger, the fear of the unknown, the fear of all the physical fears. These people will come and rape you and eat you alive, and the propaganda that comes connected with it. It's nothing more than Thomas Hobbes' thought experiment, right? So The Walking Dead is the modern version of Hobbes' thought experiment. What if we had a zombie apocalypse? And we're never going to have a zombie apocalypse, and it's not something that is ever going to happen.
Right.
It's a what if thought, but that what if triggers fears because people who watch that believe that we are going to be cannibals, just all cannibals eating each other, apart from a few select ones who will save the torch and carry the torch of humanity by killing everybody else. And I'm not really sure that you carry a lot of torches by doing that. And so I think it's perhaps rather than dehumanizing us, it limits the horizon of possibilities of our relations. Maybe.
Yeah.
What do you think about the stress that activists face, sort of concerning, like I guess you'd say, a ticking clock? That there's certainly scientific evidence that it's getting late to try to stop the results of ecological overshoot, and that we don't have a significant amount of time. And one of the points I think you made in your book was that there are instances of the suppression of democracy, and the excuse for this is that we need to respond to this crisis.
Right.
And I guess that to me it seems that type of stress is leading people today to say, I really don't have time to get involved, or I don't know what the solution is, so therefore I'm not going to do anything. How do we address that? How do we try to encourage people to know you need to at least face the issue and respond to it?
It's a great point. And I've been thinking a lot about it because I wrote the book a few years ago now. And so now I'm actually moving to the next phase of my thinking. And it's my thinking at the moment is about microactivism. And by microactivism, I'm thinking about individual and networked activism. And I'm thinking more along the lines of proactive or productive activism rather than reactive and responsive activism. So rather than responding to threats, difficulties, and what others are imposing upon us, I'm trying to follow the principle, the Taoist principle of Wu Wei. Like, I'm not putting effort to fight something.
Right.
If something comes toward me, I just move around. And I actually like to engage with people that I can create things with. And the others kind of ignore them. Now, that's the premise of microactivism. But the question actually is multi-layered, because the first thing is that while the indicators of rapid ecological change that entails the collapse, at the very least, of some forms of modern civilization are all there, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a cause of despair. That's just a signal of change.
Right.
Our mortality is not necessarily something that we should fear. Like, Aboriginal people in the Kimberleys, an Aboriginal knowledge holder in the Kimberleys once shared this with me, that when people are born, the elders say, we are given the gift of mortality. And I thought that was a beautiful thing. And the gift of mortality means that every day that we spend is a day in which we learn something. And so mortality is the gift that allows us to live those days with meaningfulness. So the change is inevitable, and it's there, it's clear. Like, unless one wants to deny, like, it's like, you remember that movie that came out a few years ago, like Don't Look Up.
Right.
Unless one doesn't want to look up when the meteorite is falling, it's clear that the meteorite is falling. But the fall of the meteorite isn't necessarily the end of time or the end of meaning. I think, again, we can enter into a relationship with fear, or we can enter into a relationship with change. And if we enter into a relationship with change and we leave the fear out, then the choices that we make in our relationship with change matters. And so then one can say, yeah, I don't want to get involved, but then the question is, get involved with what? If one gets involved with a fight, and fights matter at certain times, but most importantly, it matters to say the things that we want to say, to create the networks to say the things that we want to say, not to engage in a debate with just tit for tat arguments. Like, what's the point of writing on X, you're an idiot, you're an idiot? Like, that's no point. There's no point, right? But one can actually discuss things and exchange ideas with others. And I think that's what we can do. And 3, choosing the things that we can do that nourish those relations that we were saying before, with air, with water, with food, with movement, with sleep, with joy, with reciprocal joy and play, and so on. So perhaps, like, the most activist thing that we can do, paradoxically, I'm actually being a little bit provocative here. I'm not diminishing the importance of everything else that we do. But perhaps the most important thing that we can do is play more. Like, when we see this, just let's play more. And let's find reasons to play. And if, for all the others who actually push, we do Aikido, we do Wu Wei, we just let the push just follow its own direction. We don't really need to push back, I think. I don't know, it might be a little bit, it might sound a little bit utopian or naive as a response, but I think actually the key point here, for me at least, is to literally, like, I've been enamored with this idea of Tzu Chiang, the idea of that which is just by itself so in Taoism, so that what is neither good nor bad, just is. So there's no point in attributing value, normative value to it. It just is. And then how we engage with it then defines what we do. And we can engage in a relationship of conflict, or we can engage in a relationship of fluidity. And I think actually probably the most radical thing that we can do now is just being fluid and saying, I don't need to watch another John Wick movie. I don't need to watch another movie about revenge porn that sort of empowers me to think that if I kill all my neighbors, then I'll be happy. I don't need to do that. But if you want to watch it, go for it, man. Knock yourself out. Don't care. I'm not going to play with you, though.
Yeah.
And there's enough of us to play together that we don't really need to worry about it. There's so many of us who actually are happy to play together. That who cares, actually, if some people want to stay in their own little bunker and learning how to throw knives in the unlikely event that some zombies will actually come for them. They become the zombies.
JLo, what are you thinking?
So many thoughts. So many thoughts.
Let's hear it.
You know, I think I'm feeling very connected to the beginning of the conversation, which is that everything is already in relationship to everything else, right? We even know that Pluto exerts a gravitational force on Jupiter and the sun, as micro as they are. Everything is in relationship to everything else. The ants are in relationship to the amoebas and to the whales, you know, and so to take ourselves out of that context, to give ourselves that Descartesian separation is what so much of what social media does, and allows us to act in a way that is a dramatization of the fact that most people are, I think the average modern person is 90% of the day in fight or flight. And that perspective shift changes everything. And so when you talk about the relationships, when you talk about stepping away and moving to play, right? It's sort of a wu-wei move. And it draws me to Buckminster Fuller's idea of just create something better. Just do something different, create something better. You know, if you're going to go to a protest, make it a dance party, right? Make it a pop show, whatever. It's like, how can we shift the narrative, shift the game, and draw people away from their mobile phones, so to speak, or away from the John Wick movies or whatever? How can we create an alternative way of beingness that is back in relationship, which is what we all crave anyway, right?
I wish I could say it as well as you did. That's fantastic. I completely agree with you.
I was just pulling your threads.
Right. So what does it mean to be radically human or authentically human? We keep coming around to this idea of creativity. Maybe that's the answer here, is that we are creators of culture. That's what we do. And the answer to our crisis is to be more ferociously creative in what we build. And Naomi Klein wrote that book, No is Not Enough. And she implied that for every no, there has to be a yes. And that's what we're talking about here, is creating something.
And it's interesting because we often, often people think of play as related to arts and generally sort of intuitive creativity, like where you actually create based on sort of random patterns and sort of, you play jazz, so to speak. But creativity for some may be playing with spreadsheets, making maps, mind maps. That is just as creative as someone improvising. And I think actually, that there's, people creating these really complex and minute, like models of reality in a way, like, almost mathematical models of reality. That's a way of playing as well. But if one, like, as you were saying, like if you engage with them as play, if you're saying, I'm playing with this, I'm not actually putting out the rule whereby everybody has to live by according to those principles, but rather you're saying, I'm just playing with them. That's another way of playing. So play can have so many permutations. So many. I remember I went to a beautiful 5 rhythms session a few years back. And I don't know if you've ever done 5 rhythms, any of you. It's kind of a dance movement that came out, I don't know, don't quote me, but maybe 20, 30 years ago, something like that. And it's designed around the principle that there are 5 consequential rhythms that one dances to. And the setting is almost close to ecstatic dance, although not quite. But it's sort of low lighting, lots of people moving to these 5 rhythms that are sequential. So you've got like a staccato, a flow, a creative, like, different rhythms. And they do different things. So And you can engage with others, or you just dance on your own. You choose what to do, and it goes on for like 90 minutes or so. The session that I went to went on for 90 minutes. And what I really liked is that they said 2 rules only. One, don't talk to each other. Don't talk. Just move. So the focus is actually on the rhythms and the body. And 2, always move. But it doesn't matter how you move. If all you want to do is move one finger, just move one finger for 90 minutes. If you want to just jump around and roll around, jump around and roll around. So there's no strict format to how you do it. And what I loved actually in doing it is that you start and you feel a little bit self-conscious because you're thinking, oh, am I doing the right move? Am I doing the wrong move? But very quickly, within like a few minutes, there is no right or wrong move. You just move. And the body literally starts moving in ways that you don't even predict. And like, why am I moving a lot on the right-hand side? And I'm not really doing much on that. Like you kind of see yourself in that movement. And that was such a beautiful, playful experience of not trying to do too much, not trying to do anything. We just literally, you could just move the hand if you wanted to, and nothing else. And that's enough.
Wow.
Nice.
I wonder how much also that the way that our capitalist extractive culture and the mechanized culture and Descartesian culture has really driven us down a little rabbit hole. We find ourselves in the corner like a little robot going bang, bang, bang on the corners of the edge and not able to get out and then not just turn around and go, oh, I mean, I click my heels. I was free the whole time, right? And I wonder how much of that is just helping people just step a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right or back up a little bit or just turn around. It's like a dance move. Change the whole game.
That's so true. That's so true. I like the idea of the robot, like just keep going forward, and you literally just need to move around, and you can go in so many other directions. You're right.
Yeah.
And I think also like in terms of capitalism, because Frank, you've sent me actually this question about capitalism. I think also we need to think about what capitalism we're speaking of. And what do we mean by capitalism? Because if we mean by capitalism the profit that is created by the extraction of value derived from the distinction between allocated capital and labor, that can take many permutations. So Adam Smith said that capitalism can only exist in a system where monopolies and oligopolies don't exist. As soon as you have an oligopoly, Adam Smith's form of capitalism ceases to exist. So he envisioned 20 bakers in the city all doing bread, and people would go to the best bread maker. If there was to be only one bread maker, that wouldn't be the best allocation of resources, the best results. So Adam Smith had a particular view of capitalism. Keynes had a very, very particular view of how value was attributed within a capitalist society. So he was agnostic about the form of profit generation. But then you have Milton Friedman, Hayek, the Montpellerian Society that emphasize the relationship between profit and monetization of profit. And the extraction of capital is equated with the maximization of the financialization of that profit. Then it's a completely different mindset. And so perhaps, I don't know if you've read Yanis Varoufakis' latest book, the one where he speaks of he says that we're actually shifting away from capitalism. He said capitalism, because capitalism is defined by profit generated by the allocation of capital and labor, or the interaction of capital and labor that increase value of any particular product or service. Capitalism is radically different from feudalism, where profit is extracted by rent, the control of a particular asset by one or more controllers that then force others to pay something in exchange for the use of that asset, be it land or something else. And what he's saying is that what we have witnessed after during the COVID pandemic has been an increase in the monopolization or centralization of resources that provide the platforms that then charge rent to the platform users. And that is Facebook. And the rent is actually charged not in terms of money, but in terms of free labor. Any post that people put on Facebook is free labor that gives Facebook money and monetize Facebook can monetize with no cost on their part. So it's a rate through labor. It can be done through Amazon, where any seller has to pay Amazon just for the ability to use the platform. Or it can be done, what Elon Musk is doing, by actually controlling the satellite system. So the rate is actually by paying the basic assets to use the internet connectivity. And so he's saying that we're moving to what he calls techno-feudalism.
Mm-hmm.
And, if anything what we've seen over the last 3 months, we're witnessing these techno-feudal lords taking control of the political system in one of the most militarily invested countries on the planet, which is quite terrifying to watch. And but so I think actually when we speak of capitalism, I think it's important to remember which version of capitalism we're speaking of, because I think actually there's value in what Adam Smith said. To create market competition by regulating the market so that the market never achieves an oligopoly status or a monopoly status is actually a really good thing. So having capital in that sense is a really good thing. Is having capital as a way of maximizing monetary profit for the few, well, not so much.
Alex, this takes me back to your book, which I've been reading, so that's why I have all these questions about the book. But it seemed to me, and maybe I'm misreading what one of your points was, but you seem to be saying that the worldview is changing in advanced societies in a manner that should lead to more openness about changing the law to consider all species and all forms of life as being protected by the law. Okay, and what I was concerned about is that that does seem to be true with certain people, but given like the changes in the carbon state, which you were just talking about, there also seems to be trends that are against this. That people are simply saying, forget about the environment. We need to consume more. We need to do this. Technology will save us in the end. Do you look at if this is a given, or can you perceive that there could be conflicts in the future as to how receptive the worldview will be toward your idea?
It's very interesting in that the change in worldview is undeniable. It's undeniable as a result of the initiatives that we're seeing, and it's undeniable as a result of the way we are speaking to each other. Like the idea that plants can guide us in conscious journeys, the idea that other beings, not just what we call animate beings, but other beings have forms of what we may call sentience, that is spreading. Like I remember like 30 years ago, no one would have mentioned the idea of a tree being a sentient being,
right,
let alone a rock, let alone a river, let alone a star. Obviously, this is not new. Aristotle said that all stars are sentient beings. So it's not, there are cycles of beliefs, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So there's clearly a trend there. However, you're absolutely right. Like the counter trend of the techno fixers, the ones who say, don't worry, technology will fix everything. Don't worry, if I actually control all the satellites, everything will be okay. Don't worry, if we actually go to Mars, everything will be okay. Don't worry, if you actually implant a chip in your brain, everything will be okay. Well, that trend seems to be increasing. And you can see it, in the person I just mentioned, but you can see it in podcasts like Joe Rogan's podcast. Like although there are many voices there seems to be a tendency to prioritize or privilege certain ways of seeing the world.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps unquestioningly so. Like I'm not saying that there's sort of an intention to prioritize a mechanistic or a techno-fideistic worldview. Perhaps not. But certainly the counter tendency of the idea that technology will solve all upcoming problems is definitely on the rise as well. The combination of the two is what's potentially frightening, because these are two worldviews that clash. And the one thing that is common between them is change. Like whether we see, whatever we think actually we can do in relation to glaciers melting, well, the glaciers melt. That's a fact. The glaciers melt. The number of people on the planet are increasing. The number of consumptions is increasing. What we do about it is distinct, but that fact, or those facts, are facts. They don't change.
Right.
So the risk is that I envision is that at one point, it's not a given. Maybe technofideists are right. Maybe there is no problem. Maybe technology will fix all the problem. But if it doesn't, and I think that's a big if, it's the precautionary principle. What if that doesn't happen? If that doesn't happen, then the risk is that the state of exception will be invoked more and more. Sorry, you can't move any longer. Sorry, you can't eat anymore. Sorry, we have to kill 1 out of 3 because in order to feed the rest of the world. I'm obviously going to extreme sci-fi scenarios here, but the idea of the state of exception will increase. Europe cannot take any more migrants, and all these illegal boats. It's not enough to stop them. We need to shoot them down. So we might actually hear like an increase in calls for violence, and increasing calls for pain in a way. And so the risk is actually that in this clash, there's an increase of this sort of authoritarian mindset that still maintains the worldview of technofideism as long as they can. And I think actually the key here is the what if.
Right.
It's like saying, like, if you know that you're going on a plane that has a 0.00001% chance of falling, will you go on the plane? Yeah. If you're going on a plane that has a 1% chance of falling, would you go on the plane? Perhaps, depending on what we're going. If it has a 10% chance of falling, would you go on that plane? Well, it depends on what I have to do. If it is urgent and I have no other choice. If it has a 90% chance of falling, would you go on that plane still? So I think actually asking the question of what is the likelihood of the harm that is predicted. And one has to ask that question. And I think very few people will go just for a holiday on a plane that has a 90% chance of falling. Yeah, I want to go to see Bali, but I have got 10% chances of getting there. Otherwise, I die. Very few people would do that. And so I think that's how we should actually articulate the risk. So the worldview may or may not change. We cannot predict that. But given the potential risks, then the question is, how do we tell the story that the technofideist story is just one possibility, not the only possibility? And perhaps we're gonna see another shift. So it's really hard to predict, but I think we are on the verge of a radical change, whereby the narrative of rights of nature, of ecocide, etc., is still embedded into a normative discourse that assumes the idea of nations, assumes the idea of national sovereignty, assumes the idea of power being distributed in a certain way. And perhaps we're going to see a rise in that sort of authoritarian technofideist approach, but also a rise in alternatives, different ways of being with each other, in which we're saying, well, you know what? You go and play on the highway, I don't care. We actually go to play in the teepee. Right? So
yeah. So
perhaps, I hope.
You're thinking some form of withdrawal from society. And I don't mean to, I don't think that's the right term that I'm using, but some sort of stepping back and reflecting, and part of being radically human is just not to get caught up in the present social media buzz about things.
Stepping aside, perhaps, rather than stepping back or stepping out, is stepping aside, and not stepping aside individually, is stepping aside collectively. It's doing what you were saying, Jonathan, about rather than being the robot that goes onto social media, just move around and just do Wu Wei. So I think you're right, like Johnny. It's the idea of stepping aside from the the propaganda that says you have to post this, otherwise you have no identity. You have to see this on Instagram, otherwise you have no validation. Well, no, I do. I don't really care if you actually see it or not. I don't really like. I remember when I went. So when I got my Australian citizenship like a million years ago, I went on this. I think I was telling you last time. I went on this 33,000 kilometers journey, solitary journey of paying respect to country, and I did it on my own. And I was trying to take no pictures. And I remember someone saying, "Oh, but you take no pictures, but you know it's an opportunity lost." I was like, no, it's an opportunity lost for you because I was there. I didn't lose the opportunity to see these places. Right.
Yeah.
So it's that thing. Like I don't need the validation of other people seeing the pictures to know that I have been seeing those places, right?
Nice, nice. Well, speaking of worldviews and changes in worldview, we follow a climate activist named Peter Kalmus, and he's kind of well known because he is a NASA climate scientist who got tired of writing research papers, and he said, "Well, you know, we have to do something because the situation is just too dire." So he's been involved in civil disobedience, some of these actions, and there's a picture out there of him being chained to some building, and next to him is a sign that says, "We are nature defending itself."
Right.
And when I saw that, I was just blown away because you wouldn't have seen that kind of image, say 20 years ago, when you had scientists who were so hard-headed and so devoted to a particular worldview. Now that community is changing. So we're gonna see more of that kind of thing.
So true.
I mean, even when white-coated scientists are talking about being of nature and nature defending itself, then that's a shift.
Yeah, radical. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very much so. And it builds on what, you know, I think we were talking about Monica Gagliano's work last time, actually, and you know, scientists who are now, or Capra, scientists who are bridging, you know, metaphysics and physics, or consciousness and plant science, all the scientists who are seeing the world as interrelated and no longer as something to dissect, but something to interact with.
Right. Yeah, it's almost in a sense, it's almost, you know, John's been creating conversation around the idea of parallel polis. In other words, another way of being in parallel to, you know, sort of not to sit and be the robot and fight the robot in the corner, but instead just go create something more beautiful, more holistic, more connected, more grounded. And I'm so drawn to that idea, John, you know?
Yeah, well, we just again, it's like stepping aside in a sense. I assume, Alex, you're familiar with the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, and you know, preceding that, they tried to create a parallel polis focusing on art and other ways of life, and that to provide people with alternatives should help them become radically human. It's hard to do by yourself in the context of present society, at least in the United States, and sort of an alternative approach.
Completely agree with you. And for me, and it's interesting that you're going down that direction, John, because it's my work at the moment is actually not mine, together with a few colleagues, is to try and imagine what we call an ecosophical neighborhood would look like.
Right.
And so let's say an eco-village, but we wanted to use the term ecosophical as the idea of the wisdom of the earth. And we wanted to use the term neighborhood rather than village, because a village is a closed system, such as a community is a closed system. But a neighborhood is a porous space where people come in and out of all the time. And so if we think of an ecosophical neighborhood, what would it look like? What would it look like in terms of ownership, governance, economic sustainability, social life, food and nature, urban planning, architecture, risk and resilience? And so the idea is to try and develop spaces that anyone can come in and out of because there's a clear advantage, but not forcing anyone to be there, not designing it as the rule for everybody. But if there's enough interest. And what I'm seeing in my interviews around the world is that this interest is growing exponentially. There are so many people who are saying, "Yep, we want to live in a more radically human way. And we want to have a more direct connection to food that is not grown to pesticide. And I'm happy to pay the cost of not eating beef every day for that. I'm happy actually to what is it? What is my reciprocity in that? What can I give in exchange for that relation? So yeah, I can give up maybe having 3 cars. I can give up watching movies every night, or whatever it is. Actually, there are a number of things, but it's what can we actually do without? And I think actually, were we talking about Sparta last time? I don't remember if we were.
Doesn't ring a bell.
So one thing that I've been fascinated by is obviously it's a myth because we only have Plutarch, Plato, and a few authors actually that write about Sparta, apart from the modern myth of Sparta. And what's interesting about Sparta is that often it's depicted as the ultimate warrior society, where the Spartoi, the rulers, always trained for war. But I don't think that's true. I don't think that's correct. I think that was a byproduct of it, but I don't think that was the focus of Sparta. I think that the Lycurgus, the first legislator of Sparta, realized that you either have power or you have wealth. You should never have both.
Right.
And he said, so if you have wealth, you're a helot. You will never have any political power to control the city, to control Sparta. If you're a Spartoi, you cannot own anything other than one tunic. That's all you earn for your entire life. And once a year, they had this sacred war against the helot, where any Spartoi could kill a helot with impunity. And people thought of that as a symbol of this authoritarian regime. But the reality is that the way 5 to 10% of the population was made of Spartoi. 90 to 95% of the population was made of helots. And the weaponry used were spears. So you don't really have the capacity of overwhelm 95% of the population, just even if you're the best fighter in the world. There's no way, they will kill you. So clearly, it's not simply an authoritarian regime. And when Sparta went to war, the vast majority of the army was made of volunteer helots.
Right.
Now, if you are an oppressed majority, you're not going to go willingly to volunteer to fight for that place. So to my mind, the distinction was a bit different. The Spartoi that went to the Agorge at the age of 7 and trained in this gruesome way from a very young age, they were not training for war. They were training for self-control. They were training so that they never needed more than they never wanted more than what they needed. They trained for simplicity and deprivation. They trained to eat little and sleep rough and train rough, so that then when they exercised power, it was never in the pursuit of wealth for themselves. Power was exercised for other reasons. And the war against the helots was so that if you had one person claiming power when they had just wealth, because they had lots of political, real or fake wealth and monetary power, they were just cut off. If you had the nut job who just said rubbish, well, that day they would have had their reckoning coming. And so it created a much more harmonious society as a result. And that's why Sparta didn't fall until Philip of Macedon conquered it. And the only reason that he conquered it is that I think the mistake that they made is that the being a Spartoi was hereditary in nature, which decreased progressively the number of Spartoi to the point that the threshold was reached where you didn't have enough to maintain the social structure. And then Philip of Macedon came in and then wiped them out. But until then, they won the Peloponnesian War. They actually managed to expand. Not necessarily. I don't think because they were a military state, but because they realized that simplicity and deprivation is not a form of self-flagellation, is a form of empowerment. It's the way in which one is empowered to actually wield power with much more wisdom, I think.
Well, that's a common theme in the martial arts also. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of indigenous, you might even say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hadn't thought of that, but yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Nice. Well, what about education? So as we look at our education system, particularly here in the US, it's totally in crisis. Teachers are quitting, retiring. Nobody wants to come into the profession because it's in such chaos. Nobody knows what to do with kids. There's no unifying narrative about what education is for, even. And so how do you envision education in this ecosophical context?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? So I think you're right. What is education for? And we've seen the same in Australia, and I hear the same in Italy. It's exactly the same. So, like universities in Australia are in such a state of crisis to the point that because of the cost of education, so obviously, the US and Australia have these incredibly high student debts and student loans. And so, of course, like if you're a student, you want to have some form of return on that investment. You don't want to actually just pay that money and never be able to do anything else. So of course that forces people into a particular way of living and studying. So people will not study French philology or medieval philosophy because the return is unlikely to happen. So which makes sense, right? So people will not just go and study because they are curious about the world. They will study because they have something to they need to get back. They're forced to do that. I think there's still a holdout in many European countries where education and tertiary education particularly is free for all, because then it empowers people to pursue what they need to pursue. And they realize that that individual pursuit then translates into collective wealth.
Right.
Like it's not, education is not based around the idea that it fosters individual wealth down the track, but rather it engenders collective wealth. The more people know about more things and discuss more things freely, the more we are collectively wealthy, which makes sense, right? So there's a collective investment. So, but also that goes back to the idea that they see themselves as in relation with each other. They don't see themselves as individuals completely separated from the rest of the world, which I would say that probably, yeah, the US is one where the propaganda of individualism is one of the worst, I think. And sorry, I'll get back to that, but remind me to go back to that because it's about the narrative and the filmic narrative that is engendering that. It really became clear to me maybe a few months ago. But so education is in that crisis because it's the financial system of the education. So how do we re-envision it? Like I think we'll have to, just as we're seeing this, new things that are coming up in terms of living together, I think actually new ways of teaching each other are also coming up. And it's need versus greed in a way. Like what do we need and what is education for? And education is you remember like the Dead Poets Society's scene where like it gathers all the kids around and says, it quotes Walt Whitman, what is it? The entire life is a play and you may contribute a verse, something like that. It's a Walt Whitman quote. But he says, what are the humanities for? Like what is life for? Because he said, like, engineering, medicine, law, they're all very worthwhile professions. They maintain life. But what is life for?
Right.
Life is for poetry, for beauty, for joy, for playfulness. And that's what the humanities do. They give you joy, playfulness, beauty, etc. But going back to that thing, if I may, actually, the thing about the video, which was really interesting, and I'd like to actually hear your perspective because you're immersed in it and you can see it differently. So I grew up loving American movies and TV series. I've always been in love with them. And then maybe 5 to 7 years ago, they started to look, most of them, like I would say 99%, they started to look completely stupid to me. Like literally the plot lines, the filmic structures, the narrative, the messages, they're so banal. Like, I grew up, like my favorite movie of all time is The Empire Strikes Back. There's a depth to The Empire Strikes Back, I think. I can't see that in almost any movie of the last 7 to 10 years in the US. And I started thinking, well, why are they becoming stupid? But then I realized they're not. And that was interesting because I was watching a movie. I was watching Roadhouse, or the remake of the movie Roadhouse, with my housemate, who is a US political scientist. And we were both saying, because, the first Roadhouse in the 80s was a meditation on violence and philosophy. The new one, not so much. It's just a series of, punch outs, effectively, where everybody, and that's the important thing, where everybody is trying to kill everybody else.
Right.
There's no collective energy or collective relation there, nothing. It's just the individual who has the best punch that survives or wins.
Right.
And then she was actually, we were both thinking how stupid it was. But then I realized that she was actually reacting, and she was telling me that she was reacting to a lot of little messages that I couldn't even see, because they were internal cultural references that only made sense if one is from the US. And I started thinking, oh, that's interesting. Maybe they seem stupid to me because they're not communicating anything to me. They're not designed for me any longer. All these messages are designed for the US population. And they actually are creating an underlying narrative of individualism, fear, etc., that then permits the political results that we are seeing now, right? The idea of people in relation with fear and saying, oh, the Mexicans will come here and will take away my I don't know, whatever, my TV. When the Mexicans are really happy to play, dance, and sing on their own, they didn't really care about people's TVs, right? And in fact, actually, I think that one of the highest risks of dying just driving around the streets is in the US, not in the rest of the world, as you know. But it was interesting. I thought actually it was really clear to me. Tell me if you think differently. But it was really apparent to me that perhaps it's not that the movies have changed; it's that the audience for which they have been done has changed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a feedback system.
Yep.
And people become more narcissistic and individualistic. They get more afraid of the world at large. And so let's make a movie for those people. And makes everything worse.
I think the other thing about that too that's really important is that a study just came out showing that 60% of Americans read at the 6th grade level. Reading comprehension is the 6th grade level. 60%. This is the country that put the man on the moon.
Wow.
Right? But now the lowering of educational standards, and now parents don't want their kids to learn. There's a vast movement for parents to not want their kids to get educated because they don't believe in the system.
Wow. Can we send that 60% entirely to Mars?
But I think that talks to Frank's recursive, it's a devolutionary spiral of de-education, but that itself is a re-education and a new, very monovision view of the world, just like you're showing, with the movie, right? It's like just all these innuendos and all these insights and all these triggers for Americans. Making us more of that same. We're just pushing further into the corner as the robot.
And it is a devolutionary spiral. You're right, but I think actually that goes back to what we were saying before. So the answer is not to engage, as you were saying, John, is not to engage with that spiral and to engage with sort of an upward spiral of other things. Because the thing is, that's not the only relation that we have. That's one narrative, one story, but it doesn't control the world. It doesn't matter whether they think that they can control the world, they can't. Because the world is far too large for anyone to control it. So one just sidesteps it, says, well, whatever. As I was saying before, just go and play with the with the tiger sharks. I don't care.
Right. Nice. Well, we're getting low on time here. Does anybody have any concluding remarks that we can take home with us about being radically human?
I wanted to ask Alex a question. I'm interested. What are you doing next? What's next? What's the next big issue on your personal agenda? I mean, I have to say how impressed I am with the book, and also the way that it's been published. It's been published in an open manner that if people want to read it and they can't afford to buy it, you can download an EPUB version. So it's really designed to, I think, help train the next generation of lawyers to look at this issue in a whole different way, and it's very, very effective. So I just want to thank you for the way you published it, but I'm also interested in what's next.
Well, first of all, thank you for saying that. Thank you for reading it and really asking the questions that you've asked. I really thank you genuinely for that, the curiosity, and because I really poured. I'm not saying that it's good or bad, but I really poured myself into that book and for 15 years. So I'm glad that you're reading and others are engaging with it and perhaps finding something in it. I very actively and consciously chose to publish it open access. And so I saw a publisher that did that, and Springer does that. And they're amazing to work with. But all those publishers ask for a huge fee, 11,000 euros, which is what, like $12,000, something like that, for an open access publication fee. And Springer is no different from any others. Like all the private publishers ask for a similar fee. And I chose to pay it myself because I want people to be able to access it. So I didn't receive any funds or any support, any institutional support. I paid for that open access fee. And I do so because I'm paid as an academic. I already have a salary, so I don't need to make money out of the book. And by the way, I have no royalties. Like if people buy the book, I get zero royalties. So I make zero money out of that book. In fact, actually, I paid 11,000 euros to make the book. And but I want people to have access to it because I'm paid to do that. I've got the luck of being able to think things and being paid to think. So what's next from this? Well, now I'm focusing my attention on developing this the concepts of an ecosophical neighborhood. And so we meaning me and another 25 colleagues, have been working for a year on this project where we created a model, we call it the vortex, to try and think through how we design or co-design an ecosophical neighborhood. Then we cast that model against existing utopias, Thomas More, the Republic, Ecotopia, and so on, existing texts on collective living, Ebenezer Howard, and so on, and existing examples. And so we're now actually talking to people who have been living in different forms of eco-villages or intentional communities for years, decades, and so on. And so we're putting all of that together, and we'll do two things. One is actually to try and put that into a document similar to this book that will be open access. And again, will be used by everyone who wants to use it as a resource to design or co-design an ecosophical neighborhood. And two, we use that to leverage the credibility of a proposal of developing at least 4 such neighborhoods. And we're now thinking of doing that. One design, sorry, if I can conclude with this remark, one design that came up with is about cities and surrounds, in that we all want cities. Like Jonathan, you were saying, thank God for anesthetic dentistry, because without that, we would suffer like hell. Anesthetic dentistry depends on the existence of cities. It depends on the capacity to pool intellectual resources and put them together.
Right.
So the point is, how do we maximize the result of the city? So what came as a design is clearly very much like a cell, and it's so interesting. At the center, the nucleus is the city proper, where you've got your hospital, your university, your sort of highly intense human self-referential world, and around it you've got this, not these suburbs, but this sort of co-housing buildings that are designed with sort of green ideas, but they may be 4 or 5 stories high, and with parks and etc. And around that, there's a circle of food production villages. So there's habitation and food production, and obviously food production in the sense of regenerative agriculture, syntropic farming, permaculture, and so on. But around that, and you've got like tendrils going out, but around that, you have like a membrane almost of villages of people who live between the 2 walls, they actually gesture toward nature, but also contain the expansion of a city. And so when you look at the design, and then you've got little tendrils going out, you literally see a cell. It literally, when you design it, it looks like a cell. And so maybe the best design for a city is to think it through like a cell.
Right.
And so the idea is for us, obviously, we're not going to be able to design a city or develop a city, but we can develop 3 of these, one urban, one semi-urban or peri-urban or semi-rural, and one rural, that connect and do and perform these 3 functions. And then, create a place for us to play with each other and perhaps to expand.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, I love it. It's a form of a holon and biomimicry at the same time, in a huge
Yes.
ecosophical manner.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Wonderful. Well, we've really enjoyed this conversation as usual, and we just really look forward to staying in touch and supporting you however we can. And I'm sure we'll be talking again in the future.
Thank you. And likewise, I love our conversations every time that we have it. And likewise, you have any form of support that you need. I think actually this network of reciprocal support are absolutely crucial, particularly for you guys right now. So you have all the support that you need at any time. Absolutely.
Nice.
Thank you for doing what you're doing. Really, thank you for doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, and we'll let you go, but we'll be talking to you soon, and we'll post the video as soon as we get it processed. So
Thank you.